Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to my what I'm sure is going to be an incoherent, rambling review of Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. It seems like half the people doing Victober this year chose to read or reread Wuthering Heights, and I was certainly one of them. I've seen reactions from a number of people whose channels I watched who loved it, enjoyed the reading experience thoroughly, and I felt like to a certain extent that my reaction to the novel must be off somehow, and I must be missing something, because though the first I'd say 180 pages or so of the novel really were excellent, I thought, and really moved along really well, and the prose was really, I just thought, really almost effervescent's the wrong word, but I thought the prose was really sparkling and sharp, and I thought it was really interestingly written, and I just kind of carried me along through what is, to be honest with you, a story that I find doesn't really necessarily work for me. So Wuthering Heights tells the story, at least in the beginning, of the Earnshaw family and their three children: Henley, the older brother; Catherine, the younger daughter; and an adopted brother brought into the family by the family patriarch, who they just call Heathcliff without a last name. And these three young people grow up in a home in which they are kind of increasingly left to the care of a cantankerous old caretaker with weird religious ideas. The patriarch of the family, Mr. Earnshaw, dies. Henley inherits his property. Henley has married a young woman with whom he is embarrassingly, gushingly, public displays of affection and love with, which is, fine and could be charming in and of itself, except he essentially neglects the care of his sister and his adopted brother, who he hated from the very beginning and who hates him. When Henley's wife dies after giving birth to their son, whose name is Hareton, I believe, Henley just kind of loses it, and he just goes off the rails, and he gets involved in drinking and gambling. And he neglects his own son, and he neglects his sister and his adopted brother even more, and they grow up wild and uncouth, and they grow up violent, and they grow up disrespectful, and they're just literally horrible people. And to be honest with you, one of the things about Wuthering Heights that I begin to find tiresome is just the horrible people in the book. I don't have to have all likable characters, but it's nice to have one or two likable characters. It's nice to feel grounded in something other than characters being cruel to one another. Of course, what the novel is most famous for is the love story between Heathcliff and Catherine, which is the most unloved story I think I've ever seen. It's possible Catherine truly loves Heathcliff, but Heathcliff clearly does not actually know what love is. To put it simply, to Heathcliff, love is possession, and if he can't have Catherine all to himself, he's not willing to let anybody live in peace. He's not willing to let anyone else have her, and he literally would rather see her dead probably than with someone else. And this is a problem because she marries another man whose name is Edgar Linton, who is a wealthy man from family nearby, the Earnshaw home at Wuthering Heights, and that just turns into a disaster, with Heathcliff being a bully and Edgar Linton being overly weak, and mayhem ensues. And to be honest with you, Catherine dies much earlier in the book than I thought. And at the point where Catherine dies, I really think that the book just became tiresome, because it is literally, I think, the next 100 pages, the next 120 pages is just a catalog of Heathcliff's machinations and cruelty. He's cruel to Henley's son Hareton. He keeps him ignorant and brutish. He's cruel to his own wife, who he marries out of spite because she's Edgar Linton's younger sister, and he destroys and ruins her. He's cruel to the child that he and Edgar Linton's sister have, and he essentially neglects that poor, unpleasant, terrible child to the point of death. He's cruel to Catherine and Edgar Linton's daughter, who's also named Catherine, just to make sure you see that what the author's doing is kind of pursuing parallel stories with the older generation and the younger generation. He's cruel there. He's physically abusive. He is neglectful. He is aided by housekeepers and servants, and it's just a long catalog of viciousness and cruelty, which is okay in a story, but it just kind of stopped being interesting to me. It became more interesting near the end when I think the inevitable happens and the character named Catherine literally falls in love with the Heathcliff stand-in, Heathcliff's nephew, Hareton, who he recognizes to be much like himself, and he raises much in the way he feels he was raised. That at least brings some redemption to the story at the end, but it just ceased to be interesting to me, and I realize this is not a particularly popular opinion, but the story just got old, and it just became less and less, I think, to me, believable. The story's also structured in a really weird way. A character named Lockwood rents the home that used to belong to Edgar and Catherine Linton, is now owned by Heathcliff. He rents that for the year, and he spends time there. He visits Heathcliff at Wuthering Heights and finds he and Harriet to be incredibly unpleasant, violent, despicable people, which they are. And then he essentially gets a housemaid who has been with the Earnshaws and the Lintons essentially for the entire lives of the older generation of children, Henley, Catherine, Heathcliff, and is now raising, and also with the younger generation of children, Hareton and Catherine, who tells them this story. So we are literally getting the story of the novel third hand. Nellie is telling Lockwood what she remembers that happened. And as Hannah said on her channel, I'm not sure that really works. And it also, I think, leaves behind, one of the more interesting characters, I think, is actually Lockwood, the renter who meets Heathcliff, on whom we get our first impression of Heathcliff and the situation at Wuthering Heights from. To me, he was a really interesting character, interesting in a not very appealing way, or a not very wholesome way, but interesting nonetheless. And I just got tired of having the story told to me by somebody who heard the story from someone else who was speaking in detail from memory. That kind of strains the limits of credulity for me. In addition to that, I just found that the female characters in the novel, with the exception of the younger Catherine, to be inexplicable. Why they do what they do, why they love who they love, why they get involved with who they get involved with. You couldn't meet more unpleasant, unworthy men in any way you want to think about it than Henley Earnshaw, than Heathcliff, than Hareton Earnshaw, than even Edgar Linton to a certain extent is such a weak kind of fop that it's hard to even, admire him, his inability to stand up to Heathcliff and to save his wife. The older Catherine Earnshaw is in some ways an admirable character because we're told that she marries Linton as a way of saving Heathcliff. Heathcliff misunderstands this, and thus the source of his anger at Catherine. But why? Why does Linton's younger sister fall in love with Heathcliff? She knows who he is. She knows what he is. I mean, hell's bells, he hangs her dog, and then she runs off with him. That's a dead giveaway. If you try to kill my dog, we're not having a relationship. And then why Catherine Linton falls in love with Heathcliff's son, whose name right now escapes me, is beyond me. Other than just literally, he's so pathetic that she's worried about what will happen to him. It just fell apart for me. I enjoyed the writing very much, the first 180 pages. I found the story to be interesting. I wish there was more of the supernatural element and that Catherine's ghost had maybe shown up more often than she does, but that just doesn't happen. And so while I think the book, the description of its setting is amazing, and I think the first half of the book is great, it just falls apart for me at the end. It just becomes a litany of cruelty that is then wrapped up, I think, a little bit too neatly in the last 20 or 30 pages to be believable. And so for me at the end it just kind of failed. It is nowhere, to me, nowhere near as good of a novel as The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. It's not in that league. To me, that novel is much better. Even though that novel has a really long section in the middle, which I think could have been made shorter. That novel is far superior to this one. And anybody who thinks that this is some kind of an interesting love story, or a love story, of love denied and how tragic it is, I just defy you to find anything in Heathcliff that is redeemable at all. And even his love for Catherine isn't really love. Anyway, there you go. There's my, I'm relatively sure, unpopular opinion about Wuthering Heights. Look forward to your comments in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.